Sam Halverhovic will be moderating our conversation. Sam is the author of The Jet Age, The Comet, The 707, and The Race to Shrink the World, and is a former national correspondent from the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. Jill Dougherty was a foreign affairs correspondent for CNN for 30 years, where she reported on news developments from the State Department and traveled widely with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. For 10 years, she served as CNN's Moscow bureau chief, covering the presidencies of Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin. Dougherty also served as a CNN White House correspondent from 1991 to 1996. Sally Lehrman is an award-winning journalist and senior director of the journalism ethics program at Santa Clara University's Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. She leads its signature Trust Project, a consortium of top news companies that are developing transparency standards that helps the public easily assess the quality and credibility of journalism. And Amy Mitchell is the director of journalism research at the Pew Research Center. She is responsible for the center's research related to news and information, including how the public accesses, engages with, and creates news, what news organizations are providing, and how technology is changing all of these elements. Mitchell specializes in how technology is changing the flow of news information today and the influence of political identity on news choices. Before I let Sam take it away, we'll show a quick video.
I trust most of the news I read, but that's because I have intentionally filtered out the news I don't trust.
I'm discouraged because I feel that even in really good fact-based journalism, a lot of it's based on what's going to be popular. You know, I understand that it has to be ad-driven now because subscriptions just aren't paying journalists what they're meant, but we have to find a way around that because otherwise it's just echo chambers.
First off, I basically automatically distrust everything that my friends link me to on Facebook, even the friends I really like, because I've been burned before. I used to blindly trust the headline, and then I'd be outraged, and then I'd click through and think, wait a minute, newdailyfacts.org.com.gov.ru? I don't really believe this is true.
The president tweeting something about the New York Times fake news, or saying like the New York Times is failing or this is failing, and then see people buy into it. It's really disheartening, I think.
I think fact-based news is key in our democracy because we have to have a baseline. People from the other, both sides of the aisle need to be able to at least agree on one thing. They may have different opinions about it, but they need to agree that that thing is true. Otherwise, we're just living in alternate realities that bump up against each other and usually painfully and ugly.
How do you balance accountability, media accountability, with the right to free speech? And that's when I turn to the idea that individual agency and giving people the tools to decide what they can trust.
Journalists should be able to write about what's important, not what's going to get clicks. Like editors should be able to greenlight stories that are important, not the ones that are just going to end up on, above the fold, even online.
I would really get rid of 24-hour news as entertainment because I feel it's incredibly toxic to us. But here we are, and we've been here for over 200 years. I don't see any reason that we should throw that all away just because of the recent problems that we've been experiencing in our democracy. I think we need to recommit, and we can make a better tomorrow.
Although, first of all, I'd actually like to just give a shout out to all the people in that video asking those questions, which were terrific. And if each of you could answer all of them, that would be great. But first of all, Amy and Sally, I just want to welcome you to Seattle. Jill, I would welcome you to Seattle, but you live here now. And we're just delighted to have you all here. The late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say that everybody's entitled to their own set of opinions, but they're not entitled to their own set of facts. we're in a situation right now where not only can we not necessarily agree on the facts, but we don't even have agreement on exactly what is a fact and what is an opinion. I'm going to ask Amy a question, but I'm also going to urge anybody here, make a note to yourself to go on the Pew Research site and take this test. It's 10 statements, and you're just supposed to distinguish between what's an opinion and what's a fact. I'm glad to say I passed, but it was not easy. You really, and you'll see why when you look at these. But I would like to get a sense of sort of what the latest research does show about all of our attitudes about getting our news, and also set that a little bit against kind of a perspective of whether there ever was sort of a golden era in our country where there was an objective source of news that we all more or less agreed was, providing us with true facts.
Sure. Well, one of the things to keep in mind is just how dramatically different the news landscape and the environment is today. If we think about where we are with 9 in 10 adults in the US that are getting at least some of their news online, that brings all the different range of the types of people that we have here in the US in terms of their level of digitalness, their interest in the news to begin with, et cetera. All different types of content providers have easy access to published content. 30% of Americans were getting some of their election news directly from the campaigns themselves on both sides, and mostly digitally. And at the same time, we're living in a very heightened political environment with a lot of animosity. We're now at a point where the median Republican is more conservative than 97% of Democrats. The median Democrat is more liberal than 95% of Republicans. And so when you mix all that up, and we think about what people are exposed to, the ability to parse through this content and the fact that in the digital space, a lot of it's coming right at you as opposed to you seeking it out. You're coming upon it. It's coming at you in the other direction. How people make sense of that and parse through it really matters. And so one of the things we wanted to do in this most recent study was to get at a very basic task that's involved in that process, which is distinguishing between factual statements, so those are statements that could be proven or disproven based on objective evidence, or opinions. And so people were shown statements, and there is a quiz that's on the website that you all can take. The people in the survey had more of them, but initially there were 5 factual statements and 5 that were opinion. Overall, we had only a quarter that were able to correctly identify all factual statements, and about a third that were able to correctly identify all of the opinion statements. There were also a few borderline ones in there. What was even more striking, now we did have a majority that got at least 3 out of 5 right, but that's pretty much about chance in terms of guessing. But what was more striking was that when we looked at different characteristics of the population, we saw the vast degrees of difference there. People that are more digitally savvy, that are more politically aware, that show more trust in the news, far more able to correctly label these statements than were those that were at the lower ends of these spectrums.
I actually wanted to read a couple of questions or a couple of statements that are from the survey. One of them is, democracy is the greatest form of government. Fact or opinion? A lot of people had trouble with that one. Government is almost always wasteful and inefficient. Increasing the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour is essential to the health of the U.S. economy. President Barack Obama was born in the United States. Based on people's party affiliation, there were huge swings in who would consider a statement an opinion and who would consider it a fact.
That's correct. One of the other things we saw that was both Democrats and Republicans were more likely to label a statement as factual if that statement was in line with their party's way of seeing things. And that occurred across both sides.
Sally, tell us a little bit about the Trust Project and sort of how it came to be.
Okay. Delighted to. And one of the things I think is so interesting about this Pew study and what Amy's telling us about is that there is this merging of understanding of not just what's fact and what's opinion, but my opinion is fact. And so therefore, we've kind of, I think this is unprecedented. I read a study saying that essentially it is that we begin to just demand that people respect our opinions as fact. So what the trust, and I think news organizations unfortunately have contributed to that a bit in the effort to respond to the digital environment. So the way the Trust Project began was back when I was in an endowed chair professor position at Santa Clara University. I revived this organization called it was a New Media Executive Roundtable and Online Credibility Watch. And we had started this like in the late 1990s. And then I got everybody back, and these were senior news executives from around the country. And their concern was, in this digital environment, this is sort of 2014 or so, we're really feeling a degrading of news. We are seeing this push to try and get the clicks to please the algorithms, and admittedly some merging of opinion into fact-based reporting, because that was the feeling that that's what people wanted, what the public wanted. And so this degrading of ethics as well. And so I got to thinking, well, can't we flip the picture? If algorithms and these search engines and social media that are pushing out news now to us, if those algorithms are pushing us in the negative direction, can't we use them to support quality? And I talked to a couple of people in technology that I knew, and they said, yeah, of course you can do that. You have to define what trustworthy journalism is and what quality is. So it started us off on this journey to try to understand what users value in the news, and when do they trust it, when is their trust broken, and then marry that with journalistic values. And out of that came the Trust Project and the set of 8 trust indicators, or indicators of trustworthiness, that news organizations are now showing on their website. So for example, if you go to the Washington Post, if you go to the Globe and Mail in Toronto, if you go to Trinity Mirror or BBC, you will see these things on their pages where they show who and what is behind this piece of news you're seeing, and who funds it, what is their commitment to ethics, their commitment to including diverse voices, to making corrections when something is wrong, which of course everybody makes mistakes. But what's different about journalism is we actually go and correct it and tell you we got it wrong. So essentially that's the foundation. I can go into
how
more
many
detail
organizations have signed on to that at this point?
How many have signed on? Okay. So we're doing a controlled rollout because we're trying to understand what works well, and again, this is a global project. So starting with we had editors in the U.S. and Canada, Mexico, now and also Europe. Now we're broadening it and trying to understand, do these fundamentals really hold true? And in fact, they do. The fundamentals of what makes journalism distinct from other kinds of information do hold up. But as I said, we're sort of parsing it. So we have 14 news organizations that are now showing it on all their sites. So that's over 140 sites or so. And then we have another 20 that we're working with right now that will be putting it on their site. So we'll be getting to a couple hundred pretty quickly. In the news arena, that's not a huge number, but what we're working on is getting it solid enough so then we can scale and build technology that will make it easy for news organizations around the world to participate in this. And so I hope that not too long from now you will see these trust indicators as a standard and begin to expect them on every news site.
Do you expect social media sites to pick up on this, to have sort of the same measurement criteria, or are they reluctant?
Well, they're not reluctant. It's been quite exciting. Because you can see why to some extent, like Facebook says all the time, we don't want to become arbiters of what's trustworthy news. And from the perspective of a newswoman, we don't want you to become arbiters. We journalists should be telling folks what is trustworthy news. So thank you. And the public should be making that determination. So these platforms are seeing the usefulness of this, and every trust indicator that the public sees also has technical language that the algorithms can see. Because remember, that was the original idea. Let's help these machines do a better job. So Facebook, for instance, is using our lexicon and our trust indicators for their human evaluators to assess whether something is trustworthy along with their machines. And they're also looking at ways that they want to show it to the user. They're doing an experiment right now in the US where in your news feed, if you click on this little I with the news story, it will open up, this letter I, it will open up and show information about the site, the news organization, and information about the author. And that is all the trust indicator information. It's coming from the Trust Project. Google is looking at it, using it right now in their algorithms. So using it to assess the authority of the news site if they've got these trust indicators, and also looking at it for display. Bing, I just had a conversation with them, Bing right here in Seattle. They are showing the trust indicators as labels. So is it news, analysis, opinion, paid content, and they're also going to be using other trust indicators as well.
And what about news networks? I know Fox News' slogan is fair and balanced, so maybe they don't need to participate in it, but have they indicated any interest in signing on to this, or are they reluctant?
Yeah, so to be honest, I have not moved into cable just yet. Okay. I feel like we want to understand this environment with like the solid news organizations, and we'll see. I think that there's opportunity there, and one of the things that's happening is news organizations, as they start participating with the Trust Project, there's a certain level of peer pressure, I guess, that comes to bear, because then they look at it and say, oh, okay, we don't have this thing I'll hear often called diverse voices. So one of the things that came from users repeatedly was we want to hear from people like ourselves and unlike ourselves, not just people at high levels of business and government. And that was a surprise to some of the editors. In the US, we've been working on this a long time, trying to get more diverse voices in the news. In Europe, I would often hear, oh, that doesn't matter here, we're not, we don't have that problem that you guys do in the US. And I'm like, really? And so then we talk more about it, and then they implement it. Yeah. So there is this shift where, and I think that over time we're having an impact not just on enabling the public to assess trustworthy news, but in pushing news values and traditional journalistic values to the forefront.
So Jill, I very much want to get to what Vladimir Putin is up to, and we will talk about that. But
that's
first,
a secret.
I was thinking it'd be interesting just to get your perspective as a working journalist and somebody. I think you worked for Voice of America at one point.
I did.
Too.
That was my first job.
So every generation tends to be self-referential, and we think, this problem is new. We created it, and so forth. But maybe it's got roots that go a little further back, and I'm just kind of curious for your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think if we think that this began in 2016, we're making a major mistake. I mean, propaganda has existed for centuries, probably since human beings have been around, lying to each other. And I think it's really important to realize, I was thinking when I was asked to be on this panel, what about my career in journalism? And how did I kind of go through these stages? I began in the 1970s with Voice of America, government-run media, shortwave radio to the former Soviet Union. I speak Russian. So in those days, if I look at that, then I went into NBC in Chicago, then I went into CNN, and that's where I spent 30 years. If I look back at how this has developed, I think you really have to look at the development of the media, and then you have to look at the technical side of it, and then the societal part of it. So there's a lot going on. But just very quickly, I'd say when I got into TV, forget about radio because that was very specific, but when I got into TV, there were what we call packages. These are the reports that you see. They roll video, and they're edited packages. They have pictures. They have a voiceover commentary by or reporting by that reporter, and then they have usually quick sound bites from people that have been interviewed. So you know what a package is. So in the early days when I was at NBC WMAQ in Chicago, we did packages, but I actually was at the tail end of film, if you can imagine this, which slowed down the process a lot. It was a combination of video and film at that point. Packages were roughly 3.5 minutes. Now an average package could be a minute, It could be even less, but it's maximum a minute. In those days, the process of putting together a package began early. You had an editorial process where you decided what kind of news you were going to cover, what was that report for the evening news, if you remember the evening news. And then you had, then I would go out, I would have a camera crew, and they would have their own editorial input as well. You know, this picture would tell the story better than another. Then I did my interviews. Let's say there's a fire on the streets of Chicago, run around, talk to the police, the people who had suffered from the fire, go back, edit, and then there's an editor. And the editor who puts together this video or film has his or her own opinion about what's the best way to tell the story. So as you see, a lot of people were involved in that editorial process. And then finally, as I write my script, the voiceover, I had editors, in fact, sometimes a couple of them, who would say, are you sure that happened in 1972, Jill? Or could it be 1975? So I had fact-checking editors. I had editors who said, are you sure you're understanding that that person who was on the street maybe didn't see everything? Are you sure? Do you trust them? So this entire editorial process. Now, what happens, I'll fast forward because you could write a book about this, but fast forward to right now, what do you have? You have a soundbite from some person, could be on any subject. That soundbite is not going to be more than 15 seconds. I guarantee you, not more than 15 seconds. Politicians, of course, have to almost study to be prepared to give the soundbite of the hour, okay? So news, I would say, was chopped up into little bits. And that, I think, creates a certain chaos, an editorial chaos. You know, a soundbite of 15 seconds should, in the real world, be put in context, because it doesn't mean anything. 15 seconds doesn't mean anything unless you know what happened before and afterwards, and where was the person sitting, and what was in their mind. You know, you need context. There is no context today. It is a combination of disparate, sometimes radically confusing and contradictory information that comes at us. It's been described as a fire hose, and it really is a fire hose of information. And the editorial control, when you have a live shot, going back to my career, early on, when live shots were invented, when I was a child, I'm serious. I said, what's a live shot?
Live shot.
So yeah, I had to do a live shot, which is, blah, 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 with a camera, etc. Live shots did not have as much editorial control, because you're out there sometimes winging it at a breaking news event. So the editorial process broke down, which brings us to today. I would add one other factor, and to keep this as short as possible, but I think it has been turbocharged by the internet. Because with the web, with 24-hour news that CNN invented, and I actually joined CNN 3 years after it was founded, so I saw that. 24-hour news, you need to fill it. You need events, you need this, you need that. You need people to come back and keep watching. And so that created its own dynamic. And I'd add one other dynamic, which I think is really insidious, but it is the push for correspondents to be edgier. I like my hair to be edgy. I don't particularly like correspondence being edgy. Because it's what's your opinion? What's your take?
Yeah.
How do you spin this? What's your body language? That type of reporting. No, seriously, I can say the world is going to end tomorrow, or I can say the world's going to end tomorrow.
Yeah.
So this injection of your own opinion, I think also was part of this
So
modern world.
newspapers, I think, had a parallel in my career. It would be a process really kind of similar to what you're talking about, where you'd have a story, and through the course of a day, you'd be calling a bunch of sources, you'd be checking things, it'd go through a couple of editors. Now the system seems almost more like when you get a fact, when you get any information, it goes up on the web, and then by the end of the day, it sort of will all get stitched together into a story. And I remember covering a court martial a couple of years ago where the judge, military judge, let reporters bring their computers in. And I quickly realized that everyone around me was live blogging the trial, including sort of their own legal opinion about what it meant when the prosecution did X or Y. And my whole training was, I'm not a legal expert. My job is to go to a legal expert and get their take on it, as opposed to being, injecting my opinion. It also raises the question of sort of fact-checking of, a lot of editors and producers say, well, the web is a self-correcting, phenomenon. You put something up, and if it's wrong, you correct it in 20 minutes. But stuff gets out that people then believe. Is this a fixable problem?
Well, I'm going to jump in and defend journalism a little bit, because I think there are different sectors. So we have the cable news networks, we have the live shots, we have broadcast, which is its own arena. Then we have print or text-based journalism, which is a little bit slower and has slightly different values, I would say. Yeah, I mean, like I just told you that all journalistic values are universal, but at the same time, there is a difference between broadcast, see if you agree, but broadcast and these other approaches. And we do have in the Trust Project, we have Hearst Television and we have BBC, as I mentioned, so they're really solid in their journalistic values. What's changed, I think, Sam, in what you described, that's more like what we were talking about in 2014 when everybody was trying to figure out how, still responding to this amazing speed that they had access to in the digital environment. I remember how I was on the board of the Society of Professional Journalists, and one of our board members was one of the people who was live blogging out of a trial, and everyone was so excited and proud that he was able to do that, like get in the courtroom and tell people what's going on right now. I think we've learned to slow down a little bit, because as I talk to editors, they know and they are passionate about getting the facts right and also correcting it when they're wrong and putting them in context. And they get really upset at me when I start saying, well, the world is different now, and they're like, no, we are committed to this. And the other thing they say is everybody knows that we're committed to this, and I say, well, no, I don't think so, and that's why we do the Trust Project.
One of the other challenges that has existed, coincided with all of this, is the revenue model, and the degree to which the revenue model has just been, basically shot into little bits and pieces, particularly hitting the newspaper industry first, because that's what transitioned to the web first. If you look at the numbers, just in the last 3 years, according to the BLS data, newspaper employment has fallen by another 15%. That's on top of the historical trends that show the decline of about a third. Right. Going back to the early 2000s. So there's been dramatic decline. If you look at how this impacts local and state level reporting, reporting at the state government, we did a study that did a full audit. And even though newspapers still account for the largest segment that's doing reporting out of the State House, fewer than a third of daily newspapers as of 2014 had somebody that was either full-time or part-time put on covering the state legislature. And so those are challenges. At the same time, we have one of the differences in broadcast and print is of one's predilection towards watching or towards reading. And most people in our country prefer to watch still as prefer to read. So we have more people that say their preference for taking news in would be watching. That has yet to transition to the web. Most watchers are still TV people in our country, whereas 80% of print is, they're already web people. So that's something that has yet to really have that full impact in our country.
So one thing I want to invite members of the audience, if you've got a question, we're going to have a few minutes for that, which we'll start in a few minutes. So if you do, I think you need to stand up and look for people with mics, right? Yeah. Back there, they're going to be, I think, 2 people with mics. Let's try to do quickly my sort of gold standard question of whether there was an objective source of truth that most people agreed on. Richard Nixon famously said when Walter Cronkite came back from Vietnam and filed a report saying the war was not going well, Nixon looked at the TV and said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. implying that Cronkite had enough people who trusted him that the sentiment, majority sentiment of the country is going this way. If the same thing happened today, you know, when Cronkite filed his report, you'd have Trump immediately, you know, tweeting, this so-called news anchor with his bozo mustache has gone off and filed a fake news story. And it would immediately sort of become this divisive thing based on what your tribe sort of views about it. Was there a period where we did sort of agree on the facts?
I can offer a thought in sort of two ways, and I'm sure each of you would have thoughts as well. One is that there's also just a factor of the number of choices. Yeah. So if you go back decades, the choices that people had to turn to were far, far fewer. As those choices expanded and we had political divides grow as well and other kinds of events that are occurring, there was more separation in the outlets that people are choosing to turn to, and thereby trust. When we did a very large project that looked at sort of a whole range of different sources, huge divides in who people are turning to, and therefore, and they turn to the ones they trust. And so they're trusting and distrust the ones that the other people turn to that they don't turn to. And so there's definitely a sense of, I'm not going to accept anything that comes out of that particular outlet, in a way, partly because they have other options of where to go to. At the same time, it's also important to put things in context. And so one of the things that we've asked is, you know, we ask about trust in local news organizations and national news organizations, and we've all seen those trust numbers come down. Sally spends her time staring at those numbers daily. But it's also important to recognize that if, say, you have 25% of the public that says they trust local news organizations a lot, 20% national, then you ask about news that comes from friends and family. That drops to 15%. Then you ask about social media. That drops, news that you're getting through social media, that drops to 5%. Now that doesn't mean, and this is a number we've seen repeated, you know, consistently over a couple of years when we've asked the question, so that doesn't mean people aren't getting their news in social media. We know they are. We know, you know, 2/3 of the population is getting some of their news that way. But there's at least some difference in awareness or expectation in what's coming from there. And so it's just a more complex system today.
Either of you on that?
You know, I am not an expert, as I think both of our other guests here are, but I would say that it all goes along with society and the change in society. And I do feel that there is a great fear that people feel overwhelmed by too much news. And so if you feel that you can't really even cope, then you go to the verities. You know, you go to your, as you said, Sam, your tribe, or the people that you identify with. And if you look at the successful media operations that have viewers that come back, not just, let's see, CNN was built on a model of having breaking news and a lot of people watch it and then perhaps they go away. Fox has a different approach, which is you bring people into the tent and you keep them there. Yeah. Obviously, CNN wants to do that as well, but it's slightly different. So that when you have to go to the people that you feel comfortable with, you go to your tribe, and it becomes almost like a belief system, as opposed to an objective evaluation of truth or false news. And I think that's the danger. I do think that people feel overwhelmed and unable to cope with all of this, and so, of course, they flee to a corner that they feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so what Jill's saying really resonates with me, because when we did, I told you we did our user studies, and across the board we found people who wanted to be informed, but often very overwhelmed, and as a result, uncertain, plus all the messages they were getting. And I think we tend to go back, like we look back, especially journalists, to a time when there was a single voice and we could all believe, like we knew what the facts were. Same time, maybe that really wasn't the perfect environment that we think about, because there are communities who have felt uncovered and unrepresented in the news for generations. Think of the African American community, think of Muslims, other religious minorities, other ethnic or minorities. So I think we could be in the mode, like the optimistic me says, we're in a point of correction where we can move journalists and to do what journalism really is about and for, and teach people to start looking for that and understand that. And what that is, what is distinct about journalism is that we are not presenting certain facts as true. We are aiming for the truth by bringing in a variety of perspectives so that collectively we can come to the truth. So if you think about the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, they don't say, you know, we report the truth with a capital T. They say, seek truth and report it. Seek truth and report it. And the T, there was a big argument among copy editors. They always argue about these things. But a big argument, should we use a capital T or a lowercase t?
Right.
And they decided a lowercase t because we are aiming for that truth. And if we can, as journalists, can help people see this is what journalism is. We're not presenting an opinion, or we're not presenting a tribe. We are gathering everyone together to understand and learn across perspectives and ideas based on these fundamental facts.
Cool. So I do want to say, I realized when I was giving my example of a presidential tweet, I personally like Walter Cronkite's mustache. I'm just imagining that Trump probably would have made fun of it. So I want to see if there are any questions in the audience here. Okay, go ahead. And try to keep them brief. These are questions, not statements. Go ahead.
I am glad I came. And to surprise you, everything you've all said, I've thought about, carried, and I'm heavy. And when you say, we don't have diverse of opinions, not everybody has opportunity. I am glad I came today and have this opportunity. My question to you people, the journalists, because when I first came to this country, I had a lot of respect for journalists because they report the truth. And now everybody thinks everybody can be a journalist. The truth is no longer absolute. It is now relative. When you talk about alternative facts and other truth, I just wonder, what is the essence of looking for the truth?
That's a great question.
Because when we have the, and I'll give you one example. I know I don't want to monopolize it, but I also want to say one thing. We need diverse opinion. Most of you here are Americans. There is no country that is like America. Please, just listen to me. When you go, you have the blue passport, you have power. So when you don't, you don't. When it was reported that Frederica Wilson lied, did all sorts of things to the military people, people said what Kelly said wasn't the truth. The truth came out. What happened? Nothing. So for me now to you is, why are we seeking the truth?
So let's get to that question. What are some of your guidelines in seeking the truth for journalists? What are some of the rules? And maybe Trust Project has laid those down as well.
So, do you want to start? Or point to? Okay. So yeah, what you're saying is so important, and it kind of reminds me. I go back to the Hutchins Commission back in 1947, and this was an era very similar to ours, where there was a lot of concern about the news media becoming too sensational, that there was consolidation, and the very, very low trust in the news. And so Henry Luce, who was head of Time Inc., got together with his friend Robert Hutchins at University of Chicago and tried to define what is the social responsibility of the press. And in doing so, kind of got to that, well, what is distinct about journalism and how do you seek the facts? And I think if you take all these principles that they came up with together, that helps us understand. And one of them is we present, responsible news organizations present truthful, verified information in a context that gives it meaning. So verified, number one. Context. We provide a forum for civil exchange. So recognizing that we need to debate these things. They're not just facts that we then absorb and do nothing with. Facts are meant to act upon. And providing a forum to reflect the constituent groups of society to one another. So getting to that point of diversity, that we need to allow people to learn from one another, hear from one another, be aware of one another's needs and concerns, finally reflecting in the public's interest. So those are the 4 principles that go into good reporting.
Jill?
She'll get to the detail.
Just jumping in I totally agree. Jumping in with one phrase that I will remember to this day from my editor in Chicago, who said, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out.
I actually have a story about that.
No, it's really true. He was probably quoting somebody else, but it's really true. That has served me better than anything, because every single thing I hear, I think I should have some little bit of skepticism. People who are at a fire don't always know why the fire started. The policeman on the beat has a different view. Maybe there's another view, et cetera. So I think that's words of wisdom from that guy.
One more?
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm curious about the idea of having both sides around facts. So you're talking about having different perspectives, but like, for example, if you can come up with a fact, like at this very moment there are X number of people in this room, and maybe we have a camera to take a picture and we actually count. Are there 2 sides?
You're not talking about the Trump inauguration here, are
well,
you? There were more people there than at any inauguration in history,
but,
according to Sean Spicer.
You could go to the birth certificate thing. You know, is he born in America or not? And you know, and the problem I have with both sides and different perspectives is sometimes you need, I would assume, to agree on what a fact is.
Well, a good example of that is climate
it.
change, which gets reported on, and sometimes it'll be, all right, well, we're going to look at both sides of this issue, even if it's an issue where 98% of climatologists have agreed on one thing and 2% are saying something else. I mean,
right, so you're going to get one person on each side, one from the 98% and one from the 2%, and you're going to put them on a platform and give them equal time. And anyway, I'll let you go from there.
Well, so that's a trap that journalists fall into a lot and we even talk about, we're going to gather both sides. I think that's a huge mistake, because there really aren't, as you pointed out, there are not both sides. There are multiple sides, number one, on anything. And then we have something like climate change where there are indisputable facts. And I used to train science journalists or public radio journalists to cover science. And that was one of the things we taught folks, is to don't think about both sides. We're not like everybody who thinks climate change isn't real and everybody who thinks it is real. It's more, as a journalist, find out where the agreement of where the scientists agree on facts, and then look for the debate there. What are they actually debating on regarding man-made climate change? So that way we guide the public toward the actual intellectual discussion that's going on, the research that's going on, and the public can get engaged with that and even help push the science in a useful direction.
Amy, do the data show that the public trusts that the media is at least kind of setting up the right debates, asking the right questions?
Well, I was going to add a sort of a somewhat different comment to follow on what Sally was saying, which is that one of the elements that we've studied sometimes when we do sort of content analysis of news stories would be how many vantage points there are in the story. So, and that gets to sort of what Jill was talking about. So one would be like a point of view, but another is what's your vantage point? Where are you coming from in this story? And how many different types of vantage points are certain journalists or certain stories or certain outlets included? How many different sources are in there? We did a study of the first 100 days of the Trump administration and saw quite a difference, even in covering the same story topic, in the number of sources in total and the types of sources that then led to the assessment of the event that occurred, and that assessment being very different based on the sources that were in those stories. So who you have speaking does matter in terms of sort of factual statements versus what's opinion. If you think about the people in the room, according to the definition we were using, that would be a verifiable fact. You can count the number of people, you can say this one's correct, this one's wrong. What people could debate is that a lot of people or is it a little number of people? Is it the right mix of people in the room or the wrong? And so part of what the journalists are doing is figuring out what's the conversation to have about the facts of the number of people that were in that room.
Okay. Jill, we've got maybe 3 or 4 minutes here on Putin. We now throw this. You've got an outside influence trying to affect our democracy, our consumption of news. Bill Sapphire used to write a column called Reading People's Minds, reading Gorbachev's mind, reading Nixon's mind. So let's help us read Putin's mind a little bit. Why is he doing this?
All right. Okay, I'll try to be brief because the question is, what is he doing?
Yeah.
And then why is he doing it? Because there are multiple levels. There is the traditional propaganda that has been done forever. It was done in the Soviet days, and actually many of the things that were done, maybe not many, but quite a few, that were done during this past election were done back in the old Soviet days before TV was invented. Witness, encouraging people to come out in the streets to protest against each other, manipulating them. You probably read about that. That was done, way back in the 1930s, 40s, right. Labor issues, et cetera. So there's that kind of traditional propaganda. Then there is the military component, which is propaganda at this point, and I'm using this just in a very straight-ahead interpretation of that word, is a military technique. We use it as well. You kind of soften up the battlefield. Propaganda is cheap. People don't die for the most part. You don't have to buy tanks. You don't have to buy weapons. You just purchase something or manipulate the media, and it's cheap and it's very effective. And then I would say, okay, what's the new part? What is Putin trying to do? The debate is usually, do they want to undermine our democracy? Yes, but I don't think it's quite that, because they don't think that we actually have democracy. Surprise. They think it's all kind of fake, kind of like, it's a very cynical approach, which is the Americans talk a good game, but look at their screwed up elections. Americans think that they have, racial justice. Look at young African-American men being shot. It's that type of, everything is equal in the world approach. So what they're trying to do is confuse people and to undermine faith in pretty much anything. And sometimes to make people so exhausted by the process of trying to find the truth that they simply give up and say whatever, and everybody lies. And when people say everybody lies, I don't believe anyone, I think they've won. Because then there is no truth, right. Then there are no facts, then it's just all chaotic, and we might as well just scream at each other. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, what he's doing. So, Putin, former KGB, really truly has a lot of experience. He's an expert in this, and there are people in the government, and we have them too, but I mean, it's different.
We could have a whole conversation about the effect that it had, whether it did change the course of the election. I know I've heard somebody point out Putin didn't make Hillary Clinton not go to Wisconsin. There were a lot of other things going on, but there's a whole kind of brave new world coming of other ways that the truth can be altered, shall we say, including there's an interesting clip that involves a University of Washington project in which they have basically been able to get anybody to say anything. If you have enough tape of somebody, you can then take the words that they've said in the past and distort it. You could have Barack Obama looking out at this audience saying on the TV, I think Donald Trump is the best president of my lifetime. He's much better than I was. That wouldn't be what Obama actually said, but it'd be hard for you to tell the difference based on that. Sadly, we have to bring this conversation to a close, but happily, at least for those of us in Seattle, this is actually kind of the kickoff of a year of looking at this question. And Seattle Arts and Lectures has a program coming up in the coming year, 2018-2019, called the Journalism Series, in which we'll have Van Jones in the fall talking about a lot of this stuff. And then in the winter, the editor of the New York Times and the editor of the Washington Post, Dean Baquet and Marty Barron, will be here. And then we'll be talking about more new media, social media, with Clara Swisher, formerly of All Things Digital and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you all so much. This was great. We could go on for a long time.